Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. Now, I often talk about my mission to bring science to risk ethics and compliance. The science in question being behavioural. I'm passionate about it because I've seen firsthand how traditional methods that don't always consider behavioural dynamics can fail really badly. Because it's all very well just telling people to do something, but if you don't understand the real drivers of human decision making, then you risk designing frameworks that work in theory, but not in practice. To do that, we need to look at the way people are likely to behave, rather than the way we would like them to behave. The good news is that you don't have to take my word for it, because on this episode I'm featuring an academic that specialises in precisely that topic. Todd Haugh is an assistant professor at Indiana University who specialises in what he calls LEAD, law, ethics and decision making. So in my books, that makes him pretty much an assistant professor in human risk. In our discussion, we look at why traditional methods for compliance and ethics don't always work, what we need to factor in when it comes to designing behaviourally, and how we can best oversee that people are really doing what we want them to. If you're in compliance, risk or ethics, or subject to oversight by any or all of those disciplines, you'll find what Todd has to say really interesting, because he highlights some great ideas for how things can be done better and more effectively. The academic backup, if you like, to the practical work I do with my human risk clients. We also explore some things that come from the world's largest behavioural experiment, the coronavirus. So sorry, this isn't a COVID-free zone, but it's highly relevant to the topic that we're discussing. What Todd has to say is fascinating, so please enjoy my discussion with Todd Haugh. So Todd, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks, Christian. Happy to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you, and what a time to get you onto the podcast, because your chosen area of specialism, I think, is super relevant to what's going on at the moment. Can you talk a little bit about what that is, and then we can move in to talk about some of the things you've been looking at?
Yeah, sure. So we have a co-major here at my university called LEAD, Law, Ethics, and Decision Making. And really that sort of sums up a lot of my work. So try to think about compliance and what's going on in business and how law and ethics come together. And that almost always has, at least for me, some type of behavioral component. That's where I'm really, really focused the most.
So this is like human risk in a nutshell. You are the perfect guest for this podcast. So that's and what have you been focusing on at the moment? What are your areas of interest?
Yeah. So aside from everything coronavirus related, which is basically a worldwide behavioral science experiment in real time. So I've been thinking a little bit about that, but primarily lately it's been thinking about how to look at corporate compliance from kind of a public health standpoint. That's where I'm most recently looking, and then that ties in a lot of the other stuff that I've done previously, have to do with network theory and behavioral ethics and how compliance sometimes gets criminalized and all that type of stuff.
When we kind of look at it through that lens, what are the kind of key things that you discover that would be useful for us to think about?
Yeah. Certainly that I think there's an over focus on command and control generally when we're talking about trying to get people either to do what we want or do what's best for them. And oftentimes not as much of a realization and an understanding about how we're really trying to drive behavior. And so I think for a really long time, and this becomes kind of this default that people fall back into, is we can think, hey, let's just regulate our way out of something, or let's pass another law or what have you. And I think we're getting more sophisticated generally, that's not always the best way, or at least it's not the only way, right? And so the question for me is always, well, how do you rethink some of these assumptions going on in compliance and law? And how do you kind of infuse that behavioral component?
And the bit I find interesting, if you take the word compliance, that kind of says everything you need to know, right? And I always say it's the worst bit of branding I've ever come across, because if you were trying to send a signal that it was all around constraining people and checking up on them, and kind of comparing them to some sort of standard. That is what you would come up with, and then you would add the suffix officer just to make it even more annoying. But there is this mindset seemingly that sort of starts out with, we will treat human beings as if they are algorithms or robots, and we will try and get them to conform to what we want, rather than reflecting what we all intuitively know is that people are kind of autonomous beings with all sorts of influences on them.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So I use the word compliance just because everybody else does. And so, when you're trying to have a conversation with people, you want to at least start from what they generally, understand. But I would certainly, we would be thinking about, if we're talking about within companies, think about integrity or ethics or something, anything, or, human behavior, whatever, anything would be better than that. But yeah, I think, lawyers have sort of run the world for a long time. And what are lawyers really good at? Coming up with a bunch of rules for behavior. And so what we tend to do is just thinking about imposing a lot more rules on people in order to change their behavior. And that isn't always the smartest approach. It's an approach for sure, and it will work up to a point, but you're gonna start losing things if you go overboard.
Right, and clearly there are contexts where those rules make sense. So if I think about, I always use nuclear reactors as a good example, right? You want to be super prescriptive about what people put in the reactor, which buttons they press when. Same thing for aircraft, same thing for food safety. So there are certain roles, and this isn't necessarily a function, although clearly it plays into a sort of, skills involved, cognitive skills involved in the people doing the role. But you can sort of see there's a room for prescription. And we seem to take that mindset, the kind of health and safety cooking mindset, and deploy it into spaces where it makes no sense at all.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there has to be some kind of balance. So oftentimes people say, well, wait a minute, it sounds like you're saying we shouldn't have any kind of hard controls and we don't really want any rules. And I said, no, that's of course silly, right? But there's got to be this balance. And I think, the behavioral approach at its base is taking a wider, more fulsome look at what impacts people's decision making. And so it's not just a rule or an incentive. There's a whole panoply of stuff that goes along with that, including all the messy things that our brain does without us wanting it to do, that we also have to be mindful of when we're trying to actually influence behavior. And so, I mean, a lot of what I'm looking at is not so much just behavioral economics, which is focused, maybe on, improving wealth or improving happiness even, but I'm trying to also think about ethics. How do we actually help people be more ethical, which I think is even sort of another level of complication that law doesn't always do a great job at.
And it's really interesting when you sort of think about ethics, because on the one hand, we all kind of know right from wrong to a greater extent, because I don't know, we're born with it or we get taught it at a very young age. So on the one hand, it's really simple. On the other hand, it's highly complicated, and what's appropriate in one circumstance might not be appropriate in another. And the more you try and codify that, the more you leave massive loopholes, or you just get it wrong.
Yeah. And I mean, you can over and under correct too, because, a lot of times we'll go very broad with the law. We'll sort of create some kind of vague standard and then hope we'll be able to figure it out and get into the nitty gritty. That creates this space for people rationalizing bad behavior, right? Because it's sort of easy because there aren't perfectly clear rules. The other, we can overcorrect though, and we can go too granular. And of course, you can't, codify every behavior. You can't predict the amount of ingenuity that people have to either get around rules or understand them and craft them in their own heads in a certain way. And so we're always kind of on that fine line. And that's, again, where I think if we can be sort of smart about how people make decisions, you can fill in some of that space. And that's what I think is really exciting and fun kind of about taking and it's the approach that you take. I mean, your whole mission here, I think, if I have it correct, is helping us understand kind of the risk that comes from human decision making and behavior. And that is a lot of, in the gaps of law and traditional economic theory and stuff like that. That's what you're doing, which I think is fantastic.
That is a perfect summation. I'm glad that my kind of message has got across and it makes sense.
Good.
But yeah, no, and I find it interesting because I think we kind of we take two extremities with people. On the one hand, we hire them because they're really smart. On the other hand, we treat them like they're idiots and they need controlling. And I find it fascinating in a world where technology is taking over. You can sort of say, look, if tasks are codifiable into clear-cut yes/no type decisions, then you can give that to machines. So it's kind of this strange thing where we have this capability that if it sits in that space, then give it to a machine because a machine will be much better at slavishly following it. It's where we need the nuance, where we need the people. And, there's a few technological gaps in that, but that broadly speaking, it sort of works out. And I find it fascinating that we are still determined to try and codify human existence and human behaviors when we know that doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point. I mean, it's, in some ways, it's easy and easier to do to just come up with a new set of rules, right? Because, and again, partly we're talking about, corporate compliance and things like that. It's often because there's a historical fact that it's been, dominated by legalistic thinking and lawyers for a long time. And so what do lawyers do really well? Well, they come up with rules, right? That's how they're trained. And they understand them pretty well, right? Because they tend to craft them and they're used to working with them. And then so we sort of throw them at employees in particular, and we say, well, go do your job, but we're also expecting them to understand and remember all that information. That's just not how the vast majority of people, particularly in companies and organizations outside of maybe law firms, right? That's not how they think. They want to do their job and they want to try to do it really well. They would be happy not to know probably any law or rule, if they didn't have to. It's just not something that they spend a lot of time sort of thinking through and excited about parsing language of a rule, right? But lawyers are the other way, and so I think you get a big disconnect there.
And it's interesting, right? Because you haven't hired those people for their legal skills.
Absolutely.
You've hired them for whatever it is the day job is. And then expecting them to sort of develop this legal brain to be able to navigate the stuff seems at odds with the sort of rationale of your hiring in the first place.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the other thing, too, I think that we forget a lot about is we hire people and think about individual skills, and we then forget that people operate in the context of groups, this larger organization with, that they're working within. And we sort of expect that they're not going to be influenced by the people around them all the time. I mean, management is all about that. But we tend to think about that as sort of a top-down thing, right? If you can just project the right message to people, if you can sort of project yourself as a strong leader, people will just automatically follow that. And we forget about all these other hidden interactions and smaller groups that are within organizations. And we forget from a compliance standpoint how much that also impacts people's behavior.
And if you look around, who is doing this well?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know if I'll
tell me no one, right? Because then there's massive opportunity for me.
Well, so I will say, okay. So I kind of come at this again. I sort of been railing against it, but I do come at this from sort of like a legalistic standpoint, and so I tend to look at what the government, the U.S. government, is doing. They are just now, with the most recent guidance on corporate compliance, for example, they are just now really taking seriously, I think, risk and continuous improvement and things like that, right? And even data. So in one way, the answer is no one's really doing it all the way right, because we are just now seeing this kind of reflected in what the government is asking us to do. And so that's kind of that's a weird way maybe to answer it, but I think that is going to drive lots of behavior. And the fact that we're just looking at that now and just understanding that now means that a lot of people are getting it wrong, right? Because they're just not going to follow until a regulator says, hey, this is really important.
Right. And of course, there's a rule there. There's someone that's enforcing that rule. And you have to kind of dance that tune. And I sometimes think it's interesting. We shouldn't put all of this on compliance functions or legal functions within firms. There are regulators and legislators who not just kind of create the framework, but also impose sanctions around that I think drives the behavior hugely. So it's not totally their fault.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I've said this in writing and stuff. I mean, listen, this is a partnership. It's always been a grand partnership between government and business, right? There was never a way that government was going to be able to police behavior or even understand, even know what's going on within every business at all times. That just never was going to be a possibility. So we created these frameworks in order to deal with that. Part of that is imposing liability, vicarious liability on companies. Okay, so now we've got that, but we also do need some guidance. Hopefully, we get some guidance on how do we achieve that goal. Right? How do we meet those standards? I think, at least on the U.S. side, Department of Justice has not been a great partner in that regard, in the sense that they've said, "Here's the standard. Figure out how to meet it." And then companies have scrambled, right, in the absence of a lot of good guidance and now I think good science. They did what a lot of places do, right? They essentially came up with an insurance policy, right? They rose their compliance to the level that they would be least likely to get in trouble, and then it kind of stalled, right? And so now we do seem to be in this, I hope, kind of a new era of thinking, okay, that really hasn't worked. That approach has not worked for a very long time. So let's think about something new, and it coincides with the last sort of 20-ish years, maybe a little less, where we do have this kind of behavioral science revolution going on, and it's in people's minds. So they see this as a new tool, and it's starting to proliferate. So back to your earlier question, who's doing this well? I think anybody who's trying really hard to take behavioral science seriously and take it into account is ahead of the curve. And the ones that are including data science in that endeavor are really ahead of the curve. So, but I think that's a fairly small percentage of companies, frankly, right now.
Right. And it's very interesting when you talk about the sort of defensive decision making that goes in, it's the whole behavioral science in itself. But there's the interesting piece around how do I think about this as a company? Well, I don't want to be an outlier because I'm going to get whacked if I'm an outlier. So I'll do what everybody else does. And I'll kind of do things that sort of cover me with a mindset of I might have to go to court or the court of public opinion or whatever, I'll do this. So as long as I've followed slavishly what it says on the paper and I can defend doing that, I almost don't want to be too innovative, right? Because that exposes me.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's such a weird thing, right? Because what we're telling companies, or the sentencing guidelines have told the companies for so long, is you have to create this positive culture, right? That became kind of the evolution of those standards, and everyone saw that as a good thing, which it is. But then there was no really understanding about what that is, or how do you achieve it? How do you get there? And there also was never it just said, have a positive culture. It didn't really talk about sort of continuously improving that culture. And so I think that is something where some of these new the new guidelines, and this is a lot of Wei Chen's influence when she was at DOJ, is trying to think about this as more of like a Six Sigma or a continuous improvement kind of approach, which to me seems like it makes a lot more sense, because it's going to force people to look at risk and think about where are risk pockets, and how do we improve those. If we keep going around the organization and finding those, eventually we start eliminating some of our biggest risks. That's continuous improvement, and then we go through the circle, through the cycle again, and that is a better way to kind of look at ethics and integrity and compliance holistically.
And there's an interesting thing that always occurs to me, which is when you think about companies that are regulated, there's a reason the regulator exists, right? So the dynamics of the industry or the thing that they're doing mean that for societal reasons we want to constrain it. Now often that's because there's been a problem in the past, and therefore they've brought, and so it's driven by the never again mantra. And there are of course bits that regulators look at which are societal. So, if I think of sort of preventing anti-competitive, so competition law, that sort of thing, where you would go, actually, a company doesn't particularly care. They want as much market share as they can get. That is a good thing for them. So there's a conflict between society and them. But broadly speaking, a lot of the things that are regulated, actually, you would expect a company that was properly run to want to do this stuff anyway. So to have a sustainable culture, not to take massive amounts of all of those things, you would expect to kind of be controlled. And it's not in your interest. If I think about a company, there's particularly one that's a consumer facing, it's not in your interest to rip your consumers off, or if you're a utility, water company, to poison them, and yet that seems to be missed somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, you've got the short and long term problem, right? So, and just the agency, sort of the classic kind of agency problem where, you've got managers that might have short-term interest that don't align with the company's long-term interest. And so, that's always something that a regulator is going to have to probably manage. I mean, talk about dealing with a conflict of interest and putting your own interest over the larger group, larger society is something, right, we've been dealing with since the dawn of humankind. It's not going to go anywhere. So you need that. And that's something that, we haven't really been perfect at figuring out how to solve yet. And so, maybe some of these behavioral interventions will do that. I don't know. I think that's going to be a constant struggle. That's probably a place where you need regulation. You're always going to need regulation in some regard. My agenda, I suppose, is try to figure out how do we do that a little bit smarter? How do we help companies kind of preemptively do that so we improve everyone, sort of lift everybody up?
And it's tough, right? Because compliance is always seen as a cost, and a burden that's there to be endured. And there is an argument you can make that's a strategic advantage, right? Get this stuff right, and you'll not only get that regulatory problem out of the way, but the things that the regulation is driving towards, you'll be good at, and you'll be more flexible. That seems to be quite, that doesn't always resonate. When people talk about it, they always talk about it as a cost rather than a sort of, benefit, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've never quite understood that because if you can use compliance to eliminate cost, which it generally does, right? It's a risk mitigation measure, which means you're mitigating against a larger cost coming down the pike in some ways. That seems to be a positive thing, and that can help a company compete, and that's a good thing. I don't know whether it's a sort of a branding thing, if it's an empirical problem, right, where we haven't really demonstrated the case enough to business leaders. There's also, of course, there was this philosophical kind of debate about whether you should brand, ethics and compliance around cost and around improving sort of economic metrics, because then that devalued it sort of inherently for some reason. I don't know. That seems to have gone a little bit by the wayside. I think people have just sort of gotten more practical about it, right? And said, if we can show that it's going to actually improve the bottom line, that's just a good thing generally, right? So I think we're getting better. We're getting better with that. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it hasn't really resonated oftentimes with business leaders. I think they tend to seem, which also, of course, could be a function of it not working very well and not in the past, and not actually seeing, tangible results.
But it's an interesting one because you're also trying to prove a negative, right? Which is sort of, we have prevented the following bad things from happening, unless you've had close calls.
That's right.
So there's a little bit of me that sort of goes, it's almost like modern cars make the experience feel very safe. And we know this, that when you get new safety features, people drive faster because they think it's safer. Yeah. And there's something a little bit of me that sort of says you need to kind of feel the sort of edge a little bit, because otherwise you're just going to assume it's all okay. What are these people doing?
Yeah. All right. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the companies that oftentimes that are like the most forward thinking, it's because they've gotten in a bunch of trouble in the past. And that makes everything very salient in their minds. That increases budgets and stuff like that. So you see them moving, towards the right direction on compliance. And the problem is, though, of course, that fades over time and on all that. So I tend to think, and I think you've had Ricardo Pelifon on the show before. I just really like his very practical approach to say, what are the human hours, the employee hours multiplied by an average rate cost of your employee that you're spending fixing or at least addressing these problems. And so that if we can have an intervention that then lessens that, that is just a clear benefit to our bottom line. So we don't have to really project out Like what's the chance of some regulator coming? What's the chance of a lawsuit? All that, because we know that those rates are probably pretty low. But I can actually just show you, hard line, here are the benefits, because you're going to have to do less investigations, you're going to have to do less remediation, whatever, and plus maybe less training and things like that. That to me seems like a more kind of concrete way to take it. Now, that doesn't help on the academic kind of, should this be viewed as a cost thing? It goes the other way, because it just, makes it very granular. But I find that business people could, sort of care less about a whole lot about the academic stuff. They just want to make sure this stuff works. And so, that again is kind of part of what the message that I'm always trying to work towards.
And yeah, you talked about healthcare and sort of looking at it through that lens. What does that show us?
Yeah, I don't know. I like this idea of I've been thinking about, of course, probably since the coronavirus, following a lot of the research, just trying to think about, is there a different way to maybe conceptualize this stuff so it's not so legalistic? And healthcare has got a lot of interesting, there's lots of bad stuff certainly that comes along with healthcare and public health, but there's also some really positive things. I think about something like containing contagion. That is a behavioral exercise for sure, right? Even think about what we're going through right now. Even if you don't have a vaccine, if you can keep people to stay 6 feet away from each other, if you can make them wear masks in tight spaces, and you can have them wash their hands a lot, right? You don't really need a vaccine necessarily, right? You can really contain a contagion. That coupled with this idea that behaviors spread and ideas often spread a lot like contagious viruses, right? Through social networks, through networks within organizations. You bring those two things together, and I think you can learn a lot from public health for how you might look at doing compliance better in an organization.
And it's astonishing, really. And I've kind of been musing on this. And of course, if there is a killer virus backing this whole thing up, right, there is an imperative for people on some level, unless you think it's completely non-existent and made up. But let's assume that there's something there that's there's a little bit of a push there. You may miscalculate the risk of catching it or what might happen to you if you get it. But bottom line is that's how. But if I look at what has been achieved in terms of changing people's behaviors, it's immense. If the idea, and I always forget what month we're in now when this thing started, but you look back and sort of go, the idea of people in the US or the UK wearing masks, that was something that happened in Asia,
right? And
you sort of thought it was a bit strange, but hey, let them be. That's just happened. And we've achieved an amazing amount in terms of shifting people's norms. And I think, as you say, a lot of the behavioral stuff around sort of, if everybody else is doing it, it feels okay, is super powerful.
Yeah. And it to me, demonstrates a lot of the stuff we've been talking about, right? It's been a partnership with government and then sort of individuals, right? Buying into this new normal. Some of these, we have mandated certain things, social distancing and stuff like that, and closure of businesses and capacity, say, for example, in a restaurant, right? Those are going to be mandated from a local or state government. But then there's also this whole behavioral piece, right? The government can't be following you around, making sure you're wearing a mask and washing your hands at all times, right?
So Facebook can, but
right, yeah, good point. And that's another piece to this too, which is the use of data collection. And again, that's a place where I think companies could do a lot better. They could learn from public health quite a bit, which is, we can actually use data and think about using data in a smart way. And so all these things are sort of coming together, at least in my mind. But a lot of it is gonna go down to kind of people's individual behaviors, right? And so then the question is, well, how can we kind of foster those good behaviors, right? What ways can we think about that? In the United States, of course, right now, we seem to be seeing this big resurgence, and particularly in a number of states, right? We've fatigued on all these things that we bought into a month or two ago. And now, at least it appears, I know this stuff is there's a lag with the reporting, but it appears like the numbers are going up. And so now we're in this very difficult situation where what seemed like a durable norm, right? Staying socially distant and staying indoors and stuff has really eroded. And there's a very bizarre thing going on where there's a moral question and even a, sort of a rights question about wearing masks. And so now we're going to have a real experiment about, can you mandate something that goes against the individual norms of a big group of people? And that is very, very difficult to do.
I mean, it struck me that the behavioural fatigue is one thing, and I want to talk about that in a second, get your views on that. But the other bit that sort of occurred to me is that to start with, lockdown's really easy, right? Because you sort of say to people, here's the clear guidelines, you'll need to do this, and people can kind of understand what's going on. And then we had this kind of loosening up. And of course, it doesn't help that you can see what's going on in other countries in a way that historically you wouldn't have been able to. So I can get pictures beamed to me from anyone who happens to be wandering down. And of course, that can send completely the wrong signals to me about what's happening elsewhere and trigger certain things in me. But it does seem to me that it was, we've got some really good examples here of where unclear messaging, bad role modeling, conflicting piece, all those sorts of things. So all the sort of things that we talk about, tone from the top and culture within organizations, we've lost a lot of that stuff. And so the locking down people down was relatively easy. What we've seen now is it's very messy because we've had conflicting messages and I don't even know what the rules are that I'm supposed to live under. And I sort of sit there and go, I kind of don't care what those rules are anyway, because the risk hasn't declined. It's, there may be less chance of catching it, but ultimately the ultimate risk. So there's a strange thing around people's risk perception, and we sort of seem to expect people to use their common sense. And yet, in a way, society's doing everything it can to make that really hard.
Yeah, it really is. It really is difficult. I mean, there's so many conflicting messages. Not to mention, again, kind of back to this idea of having a little sympathy for people in that regard is also the science has changed quite a bit too. And so, what doctors and public health officials understand now is a lot different than what they understood 3 or 4 months ago. And that's actually, that's a natural and expected in a time of crisis, right? Things are going to change. But I think it's a good proof. It's proof that you have to be really careful because some things that you say or how you message can be a lot more durable than you might imagine. And so, you got to be kind of thoughtful about what you're doing. I certainly have no, magic bullet on this, but you can see the results, the negative results of what happens when you're not consistent with messaging and tone. And, and we're basically trying to, you're trying to create like a culture that's the entire nation. I mean, that's really, really tough. That's really tough.
Right. And the sort of behavioral fatigue piece.
Yeah.
Is that because there was a little bit of discussion, I'll put it mildly, here in the UK around, and the government's approach was very much, they claimed, based around the fact that they saw this coming, and therefore that delayed the lockdown here in a way that I think has generally been deemed to be not helpful. That's something, going more broadly than just the current scenario. Is that something we need to think about?
Yeah, I mean, listen. It's always going to be difficult to ask people to do something that's either hard or time consuming or cognitively, taxing for them. There's always going to be some level of fatigue. So you got to have a pretty strong norm that's going to enforce that until you can kind of get through that and it just becomes habituated.
Right.
And so we can do that, right? We've done that in other contexts. So you think about seatbelts and helmet laws and smoking, is another one, for example, where we really have taken something that people felt was like a personal right of theirs, and we shifted that norm. And where there might have been fatigue, we figured out a way to kind of sort of from the ground up, right, actually get people to do it on their own. We're in this weird space, particularly with masks is the one I'm thinking about right now, where it started out like maybe, and then now it's like, some people have really went into their different camps. And I think it's going to be very hard to overcome that. I mean, hopefully that will be the case, but I don't know.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? Sort of there seems to be, everybody has an opinion on it. Yeah. And you sort of stick to your, and we see it as a sort of polarization, I guess, as we see with politics, and the mask thing often falls down political lines as well. where it seems to play into broader piece. And as you say, once people have made their mind up about something, shifting them starts to get personal, no matter what the science says.
Yeah. And I mean, the way that I have seen that, I would take an example again, kind of drawing some parallels from public health, but think about smoking. It to me seems like a really good example where people saw this as sort of like, it was totally accepted. It was like a personal right? If I want to, hurt myself, like that's up to me. Right. Okay. And then we passed some laws that made it more difficult in some ways. And it was rebranded, recrafted as harm to others, right? Where secondhand smoke was really shown to be the real problem. And that kind of shifted our thinking, right? It shifted us out of, well, this is just something that only affects me to something that affects other people. And then the norm changed, right? So you have groups that say, well, you know what? I don't want workers to be getting, sick and cancer and stuff like that because they're in a restaurant with a bunch of people who want to smoke because they only think it hurts them. And so that was a really interesting, there's a certain morality that then was imposed on smoking that was different than before. The odd thing with masks is, to me, it seems like a more obvious thing that's always going to hurt other people. The purpose of wearing the mask is not to help to protect you, it's to protect other people, right? That's always been the case. But that hasn't quite gotten through now. And I think that's probably a part of an issue of messaging and tone from the top as well, right? That has not been the consistent message. It has been, well, maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. I'll wear one when I, think it's, when I have to, and you see a lot of public officials not doing it at all. So that sends all kinds of crazy messages. So yeah, we're in the middle phase here where I don't think there hasn't been a norm established yet. And so it's unclear where that's going to go.
That's interesting. Wow. Watch this space then.
Yeah.
And if I think about within organizations, as you were talking, I was kind of thinking, well, when an organization tries to impose a compliance or an ethics requirement on people, of course, the individual will have their own views as to whether that is, is that proportionate? Is that appropriate? And as I think about some of the dynamics you were talking about, employers could pay more attention to what their employees are up to. So there's greater amounts of data. But of course, you very quickly get into privacy issues, and there are so Germany is a good example where this the what you can monitor is heavily restricted. Other countries are freer, but you will always have this dynamic of individuals having their own viewpoint on it, and that's kind of interesting, particularly when it gets into the ethical space, because I might not have, if I'm working in a catering situation, I may not have strong views on food hygiene. But I will have strong views on certain other ethical sort of topics. That's quite a big challenge, isn't it, for organizations, because you're dealing with sentient beings that have a position that they've gathered from influences from outside your organization. It's not like you can contain their thoughts on that within the office or the workspace.
Yeah, and of course you wouldn't want to, right? I mean, back to your earlier point, right? You hire these people because they're individuals and they have things to bring in a certain in all kinds of talents and gifts and all that. And so the last thing we want is a bunch of automatons that only think one way. That's not a good thing, right? Okay. That said, right, we want people to be kind of on board with the overall mission of our organization. If they're not, right, they're probably in the wrong place, either for the company or for them. All right. So, I mean, how do you do that? Well, partly, I mean, it's going to be toned from the top, certainly. Right. So one way to signal values is to say, here's what our values are. And that attracts, individuals, attracts employees to your professed values. So long, of course, is that you're consistent with those values and actually follow through, because otherwise it creates all kinds of other problems. But then once you get them in there, right, once you get them in the organization, there's been some self-selection. I think you have to kind of cultivate that from the ground up. And so you have to try to create a space where people can follow their own ethical, moral compass as much as possible. And they feel like, hey, the norms of the organization, the culture of this organization is that we do the right thing. And when we don't, we are free to point that out. And people are going to receive punishment, yes, but not disproportionate punishment and things like that, right? So there's a legitimacy to the whole endeavor, and I think that's a way to build these really strong cultures.
Wow. Couple of things I want to pick up on that. The first one that occurred to me is obviously a big theme at the moment is diversity and inclusion within firms.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting pieces around compliance is, of course, what you're doing is trying to control people. And you talked about the hiring process to get the right people in, and then get them. You can then allow them to be themselves. And of course, one of the challenges if you're trying to build a more diverse workforce is that they may come at things from a different angle, which is awesome when it comes to challenge.
Right.
That poses interesting problems from a compliance perspective.
Yeah, now, okay, certainly, and I'm no expert on diversity and inclusion, although, we're all, I think everybody in an organization is trying to think about this in a smarter way now. I think we have an obligation to do that. And I'm certainly doing that with my students and my, my institution. One of the problems, of course, is there haven't really been those diversity of ideas in a lot of places. So there's some sort of historical problems where, now we're all kind of trying to rush at it and say, oh, let's be diverse and have this, inclusive environment, but you actually don't have people there to offer all those different kind of those different ideas. And so, so you got to fix that. That's part of the issue, of course, is fixing that. But you can have diversity of ideas and you can have diversity of backgrounds and still be sort of have a common mission, right? And I think resilient, smart organizations can have both, right? You can say, this is what we want to do. This is what we're working towards. And there's going to be a space within that to people to bring their own backgrounds and unique ideas to that endeavor. In fact, I think that's what you want, right? Because otherwise we get the other problem, which is a bunch of groupthink and everyone just kind of says what they think, a supervisor or a leader wants to hear, and that we know doesn't make for good decision making either. So there's a middle ground, I think, that can be found, but it's always going to be difficult. You're always going to be calibrating, all the time.
Right, and to a certain extent, you kind of want people to be testing the boundaries of your framework, because if I think about how one manages risk, there are certain things where if you stuck to the kind of letter of the law, you would miss the point. And we've seen it particularly around COVID, where I can think of lots of companies that I have relationships with, where if they were to try and enforce their contract on me as a customer. Right. They get the wrong outcome. Yeah. And so we've seen a lot of shifting around it. And I think it's really interesting when you look at, if you're just running your business based on what does the law say, what do the regulations say, actually social trends will shift. And so we can look at this in generational terms. And there are certain practices that, Gen Z will not find acceptable, naturally not find acceptable, that somebody that's been sitting in the company for 500 years wouldn't even occur to them. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think there's an interesting piece that says to me about you almost need a little bit of stress testing of your compliance framework and your ethics framework, so you can catch some of these things early on. Otherwise, you can be massively blindsided just by slavishly following rules that were fit for questionable, but theoretically fit for purpose once upon a time, that aren't anymore.
Yeah, and that's a huge challenge. You're absolutely right. What I tend to see is there's a lot of accretion of this stuff over time. There's a lot of accretion of rules over time because as new problems pop up, right? Again, this is sort of back to our earlier conversation. People just add a bunch of rules, and there isn't always sort of this thoughtful thing about, okay, well, is this either staying up with the times? Is this, has our business changed in a way that this isn't really necessary, or it's going to send the wrong signal? And also, because people tend to like clear guidelines, they like to stick to that. So, and also you have personality types as well, right? Certain people are just more rule following generally. Right. And so, they find comfort in that, right? Where there's others of us that like a little bit of ambiguity, because that gives us freedom. These are not things we're going to solve. You and I talking about it. It's more of this kind of constant challenge thing, which is again why I like the risk framework approach when you think about compliance, which is constantly sort of evaluating your risks and seeing where those change. Some things are always going to be, from a business standpoint, are always going to be on your risk framework. But we're hoping that that kind of as we continue to do this, we're getting either more sophisticated, and where we've mitigated a bunch, we can kind of push it farther down in that risk framework. And we're also seeing new things pop up. So I think that's a nice way, hopefully, to get some of this flexibility built in.
And I think it's I guess it's even having this discussion, right, is a healthy thing. Where I think you get an organization that's not even willing to think about this because it's a bit too difficult. Yeah, right, is going to get blindsided, and therefore just even opening that box and going, let's just have a look and see what's in there. How can we think about it?
Yeah, and I've worked with companies who that have this great culture, this great historical culture. A lot of times, smaller companies, that have gotten big quickly. They begin from this where they have a founder. Oftentimes, one or two people or a small group that really set the tone for the entire organization. And because they're small, they're sort of guided by values and things like that. And that works really, really great for a long time until they get really, really big and their culture changes and they still sort of believe themselves to be this, bastion of sort of values, right? In some ways, it's been a long time since it's been small, but, you think about Wells Fargo's maybe an example of that, right? Where they were this sort of always looked at this kind of small retail bank. They wanted to be in retail banking. They didn't take risks like a lot of the other big banks did in the crisis. Sort of saw themselves as this kind of like mom and pop bank, even though they were massive, and they overlooked all kinds of problems in their own house. Right. And that's they might not be the perfect example because they're awful big, but I do think that happens where the culture has shifted, and the people that are at the top of the culture don't really realize that, and that obviously creates problems.
Right. No, I think it's a great example because if you look at the branding and everything else, it screams we've been here a long time and we're friendly and all those things. And it's almost the last place you'd expect that stuff to happen precisely for that thing. And so I think that's almost it almost permits it, right? Because it's sort of a little bit sleepy around that whole issue.
Yeah. Well, and you get into all kinds of trouble when you have a misalignment of rhetoric and the behavior, right? So if you are holding yourself out as this mom and pop, great sort of place or whatever, and then under the hood, the employees see, it's not always the customers that see it, but the employees see, well, wait a minute, that's not really how, the executives are acting, or we say we're this thing and we're actually something else and people kind of know it. That is a real problem. Talk about a way to erode the legitimacy of your compliance program, but really your whole management program very, very quickly. We know, right? Humans are very, very attuned to hypocrisy. That is something we are extremely good at, right? We can ferret that out very, very quickly. And so when we see that, then we see legitimacy problems a lot larger.
Yeah, it's funny that ability to smell stuff, I think is really interesting because we sort of, again, it's back to the codification piece where we kind of go, we will have some rules and it looks really good on paper. And people kind of just, it's like, I always think if you start a new job or you go somewhere, you sort of spend your time sniffing around. Yeah. And working out what's what. And I know what it says in the rules, but what does everybody actually do? And how do I fit in it? And so I think there is something really interesting here in the compliance space, which is it's thought of as a very sort of, book-worthy discipline. And actually what you're seeing on the ground is people are just going, well, I know what it says there, but let me just check it out for myself.
Yeah. Yeah. That's absolutely right. I sort of, just on a real practical level, I sort of advocate for kind of simple statements of what your mission is, what your culture is. And then, let's just sort of put a guideline out there that people can come to. And then let's get into kind of trying to build this sort of bottom up approach as opposed to, these, a policy manual that's, 200 pages. First of all, no one cares or will read it anyways. And secondly, it's not likely to stay in line with what the actual, kind of word on the street is, right? What the street level bureaucrats are doing, if you will, because because that's really what matters in actually setting a culture or setting a tone in an organization.
And the other thing I wanted to pick up with you was what I'll loosely term the criminalization of kind of compliance, and this idea that the way we manage this is we punish people.
Right.
And I'd love to get your thoughts on that, because I know you have some.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of, I think my first sort of foray, I guess, into compliance was trying to understand kind of historically, like, how did this work? What were the eras of compliance? And I mean, you basically see this cycle over and over again, at least in the US, but I imagine it's probably most places, where you have a business scandal of some sort. There's a legislative reaction to that filters down into rules. Oftentimes there's a criminal component to those rules that we're talking about, big scandals. And then that comes into compliance. And again, there's almost always an adding of rules. Nobody ever takes rules away. All right. I mean, very, very rarely. Right. And so then you get to this place where compliance is all about, hey, here is a huge set of rules that govern every possible, scandal that's happened, not now, but it happened, since the 60s or the 30s or whatever else. And so, and that creates all kinds of problems. First of all, it's just unworkable. I mean, nobody can really manage all that. And we spend a lot of money, companies do, and compliance programs do, to try to train on all those things and actually make them salient for employees, but it's not really working. And then the other piece to that is, I think it creates, or can potentially create, the situation where you actually do hurt legitimacy of the larger endeavor, which what you're trying to do is have sort of this culture of integrity, because people become kind of so concerned about either breaking a rule or the monitoring measures are so onerous to make sure that you're following these things, that it erodes what you're actually after.
I mean, it always strikes me, it's a bit like, they couldn't get Capone on anything, so they use mail fraud.
Right.
And it's sort of a bit like that in organizations where there will be, and I used to get in real trouble for saying this, but I had the theory that every single employee breached a policy or a rule. I used to say once a day, but,
right.
Let's be uncontroversial, once a week. And people go, that's how you can't say that. And I'm like, I'm pretty damn sure they are, because that's not because they willfully going out to go, which rule can I break today? But actually because as you say, you've built this thing up. And I used to use the analogy of in the city of London, there are regulations that go back to the, 1200s, whatever, some of which involve you can drive sheep across certain bridges at certain times. There's just city rules that are no longer applicable that they don't enforce. But I kind of look at it and go, actually, if you've got a rule book in an organization and you're not looking across the piece, then you are going to have these things. And it just feels really oppressive. And it kind of feels like it's skewed against you as an employee, because you go, they're out to get me. And, things like annual attestations. Have you read all of the rules? Well, you want me to lie then? Because nobody has.
Right.
I find this sort of stuff fascinating. And if you then back that up with a very punitive regime that kind of goes one strike and you're out type mentality, then you have people treading on eggshells and kind of spending more time ticking boxes than doing the right thing.
Yeah, well, and this is the sort of over criminalization kind of argument larger that's going on in the criminal law space. It is particularly, I think, problematic with white collar crime generally, because you have so many regulations that govern business. I mean, again in the U.S., it's roughly 5,000 federal provisions have a criminal. It's 5,000, 300,000 regulatory components that can be punished criminally. Okay, actually, they tried to count them and they couldn't. Right, they sort of lost count. They can't figure them out. It's true. Okay, and so it's not that bad within organizations. Okay, but you can see how that stuff goes. Right, and what happens is then anything that's enforced is inherently sort of arbitrary, right? Because there's too much possible enforcement. And so anything that's actually, any punishments that are meted out are just based on, in some ways, the whim of who happens to be in charge or what they're looking at the time being. And so I think that same thing can happen in organizations, right? Where there's changes about, well, we're going to punish this thing one time and it was okay. but now we're going to punish something different. And so you get into a difficult situation where employees look at this and say, wait a minute, that's not consistent. There's this hypocrisy problem again. And now, you know what? I think the whole thing is bogus, right? And then you've got a real problem, because now people can start rationalizing all kinds of bad behavior under this larger umbrella of, you know what, this whole thing is sort of made up anyways, and we all sort of know it.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So it's a bit like this. It's like the Taliban. It's a regime I don't recognize.
Yeah.
And so I just, yeah, that's fat. Wow. That's fine. So what's the solution on that? Because the logic would sort of be, I need to have credible deterrence here, so I will enforce against these behaviors that I don't want. What should organizations do to kind of deal with that? Because it seems like the solution isn't just, as you say, arbitrary punishments for certain things, but how can you have that credible deterrence? Or do you need that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's less law or less rules, frankly, and probably, hopefully, more enforcement of less law, if that makes sense, right? So instead of lots and lots of little laws that you cannot enforce, or lots and lots of little rules that you can't enforce, a lot less rules, and then when there's violations of those, swift and sure, punishment. And I think that generally people can get behind that, right? Because what that means is that what you're enforcing is actually the egregious stuff that really matters, right? Now, it does inherently bring in a little bit more vague, because those laws have to be, or those rules have to be written probably at a higher level, right? Because one of the reasons you get so many rules is because you're trying to, codify every problem.
Right.
That can create its own problem. So I think you need the culture piece, to help enforce that, right? Where you're not going to have a rule on every single behavior, but the overall rule is going to be, let's do the thing that's either good for the organization or good for the customers or what have you. And so there's going to be some self-policing. And so I think the data is all, the research is pretty consistent on this stuff, right? People don't really follow deterrence, They don't really get it anyways. I mean, generally, yes, but we have a real trouble like calibrating deterrence. We don't really know how exactly to mete out punishment in a way that then will stop further wrongdoing perfectly. We just don't, right? So we have to kind of do it from a high level. And if we do it in a way that's not arbitrary, in a way that's fair, that will actually create kind of this internal issue with folks where internally they'll not want to violate the norm or violate the rule. That's much more effective because that operates all the time, right? You don't have to have like a perfect enforcement or perfect monitoring mechanism because it's going to come from within. That's what we all at least should be working towards. It's going to be a ways to get there, but that's what we should be working towards.
Right. It's interesting when you talk that, because I sort of, again, you have these often you have sort of different level 1, level 2 violations.
Yeah. Right.
Again, and you sort of go, well, these things are level 1, these things are level 2. And I always find it interesting because you sort of go, actually, if I've crossed the line and I'm already in trouble, what the hell? I might as well keep going, right? Because I'm in that. I sort of banked that thing, and I see lots of instances where people get themselves, rogue traders in banks is a good example. You get them, they don't set out with the intention of doing that. They get themselves into a whole lot of trouble, and then it's like, I cannot possibly come forward because there's no path back, and I crossed the line, miles back. It's not even sort of like a small thing. And I think that's a really interesting piece. And as you say, if it can become a bit more self-policing, that's a much more powerful force than this authority that I then have a battle with.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely what you're describing is my experience. I mean, I practiced law. I was a criminal defense attorney for, about a decade before I started in academia. Yes, there were some clients who set out to do the bad thing, and that was pretty darn clear, right? Okay, fine. You deal with that. Those people are going to get in trouble and they're going to take a plea agreement, and that's that, right? But there's the vast majority of the folks that I saw where someone did something sort of stupid or reckless and then got themselves sort of down a path and then were unable for many reasons. And this is not excusing their conduct, but it's a better understanding of their conduct. It's this chain of events. It's not usually just one thing. I'm going out to rob the bank or rip off the company. It's, I was trying to solve a problem that I had, and I did it the wrong way. And then I got myself sort of deeper and deeper and deeper until it became a very, very big problem. So what you would certainly hope for is for them to understand at the beginning, I shouldn't do that. Sure. But if I do, there's a way out of it for me. And maybe it's not, and maybe it's not one that I can keep my job, but at least, there's a way where I can sort of take the foot off the gas, and then it gets that conduct gets discovered a lot quicker. Right. And then we don't have this kind of big, massive sort of blow up, and the risk doesn't go from low level to high,
right.
Before we can discover it.
Yeah, I was always I went to see an airline and to talk to them about how they think about it. It's always interesting because airlines are really good at managing the risk in the sky.
Right.
There's sort of mechanical risk and those not so good on data privacy and some of these other sort of issues. Well, you might lose some issues on the ground. But it's interesting because they were saying if a member of flight crew has a drug problem, if they come to us, right, we will do two things. One is we'll pay for them to go into rehab. And two, we will work to get them back in the sky.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not a case of you come forward and that's your flying career over, because that's a huge disincentive. It's actually going, look, if you work, if you don't, you're never flying again.
Right.
But if you do, we will work with you to try and solve this problem. And they were like, you probably think that's really shocking. And I just thought, actually, that's really smart, because you do need people to self-report stuff. And if you make it impossible, stakes are too high, then what are they going to do?
Yeah. And that's, that gets back to this, like, that's a public sort of health model, right? Which is, hey, let's treat this like something that we can rehabilitate and deal with, right? Yeah, you have to have guardrails. So sure, if it's your 10th violation or 10th ethical violation or something like that, right? If you're a cop that's, got 17 complaints, right? You can't be on the force anymore, right? Just like you've demonstrated that you are unfit for this line of work. Okay. That's different though than, saying, like a zero tolerance policy. I think zero tolerance is sort of, it's good in theory. And what happens is just, it tends to drive behavior under the rug because people feel loss a lot more than they're going to feel comparable gain. And so they're going to see all that as potential loss. And so they're not going to bring it up. Right. And they're going to make sure that nobody else brings it up. Right. And then you've got the situation where you have a festering risk or a festering harm, and it builds under the surface until it explodes. I think that's the Wells Fargo example, where if you had a situation where we could have understood a little bit about what was going on, it probably could have been taken care of without 5,000 people committing a crime and losing their job.
But it's interesting when you talk about it in those terms, right? They'll stop anybody else talking about it. That immediately made me think of those kind of cop shows where there's a renegade cop and he, silences anyone. And there's probably other contexts, but that's the one that obviously comes to mind. Yeah. And I sort of go, we know this stuff intuitively. We've all seen TV shows. And I thought about The Slippery Slope, Breaking Bad, another good example of good guy gone massively rogue. It didn't happen overnight. But what I find interesting is all of this stuff, we intuitively understand it. And we know, people with kids understand how to run a compliance regime that is effective, because you watch what happens. And put it in a corporate environment, we lose any sense of the stuff you've seen on TV or the stuff that from your own domestic environment.
Yeah, it is sort of strange. I mean, you're absolutely right. A lot of this stuff is not, it's not rocket science. I mean, I shouldn't sort of denigrate my own position here, which is like a lot of it, you don't need an academic to tell you like what, how human behavior works for a lot of this stuff, but you have to remember it, I think. And so sometimes we get fixated on certain ways of doing things, in business, it's all about incentives, it's all about, let's pay people X, Y, or Z. We tend to think that that's the main reason why people make decisions. That's not really the case. I mean, sure, it's a component. Yeah, of course. But a lot of it has to do with relationships and has to do with self-worth and, what do you get value out of in your day to day and things like that. And so, what I end up trying to do, or what I end up doing a lot of, is trying to sort of remind people of the stuff they kind of inherently know, and then give them the behavioral science and some of the legal tools in order to put that into, to convince others that your intuition in some ways is correct, if that makes sense.
And it's a fabulous note on which to finish, partly because my voice is going, but not least because I think, compliance feels like such a clunky instrument. And what you've beautifulally demonstrated in what you've talked about is there's a massive human component here.
Yeah.
And if we can take that stuff that sort of makes us all happy to be alive and into human interaction and put that into, we can, one, it makes it more fun, right? But two, we can get better outcomes. So thank you, one, for being on the podcast, two, for your great research, because I think it's shining a light on compliance in a really, really healthy way, and that makes me happy.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. I really appreciate it. It's a great conversation, and I really enjoy what you're doing with the website and the podcast, and keep up the great work.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Todd for appearing on the show, and to you for listening. If you're new to the podcast, you can find it wherever you get your quality audio content. It's on all the major platforms. If when you're on that platform, you had an opportunity to leave a 5-star review, that really does help other people to find the show and to raise the profile so that I can continue to attract high quality guests. To find out more about Todd's work, have a look at the show notes. But otherwise, I'll see you very soon for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast, wherever you found this one. Thanks for listening and stay safe.